Are you ready to branch out, to take a leap of faith, to love yourself and others fully? Then let go of whatever no longer serves you to take action now on Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills, living it up, loving it up, and letting it go. Erica will energize and excite you to power up your passionate dream that sets your soul on fire. With Erica's E3 approach, equipping, empowering, and enlightening yourself so you can be yourself for yourself. Get ready and get rooted to live a life without regrets, without what ifs, without should haves, and especially without empty feelings from a life unexplored. This hit show helps you build powerful and intentional roots to live it up, love it up, and let it go. Get fearlessly ready and powerfully rooted in your yes with your host, Erica Gifford Mills, and be fearless about your more and stand in your yes. Now on Get Rooted Radio.
Welcome, everyone. I am Erica Gifford Mills, and you are listening to Get Rooted Radio, living it up, loving it up, letting it go, right here on Transformation Talk Radio. A big shout out to my producer today, Emily. Emily, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful. Show 2 in the last 6 months. I'm really excited for this one. So this episode is titled Demystifying Mindfulness. And as if you looked at the episode description, it is it's one thing to read about mindfulness and have an intention of slowing down in life. And I can attest to that. I always say I'm going to slow down until I'm forced to, but it's another to deliberately cultivate awareness into your thoughts, emotions, and sensations. With mindfulness-based stress reduction interventions becoming a staple in the healthcare industry, it becomes important to understand the power of acceptance in the setting of change. This episode, along with my guest, is really meant to highlight the techniques people can apply to their circumstances so that they can gain awareness and facilitate new relationships between the mind and the body that promote harmony rather than resistance. And so excited actually to have my guest on. Dr. Lyndsey Wallace is a board-certified clinical health psychologist and associate professor at the Medical College of Wisconsin. She serves adult oncology population ranging from newly diagnosed through recovery and into survivorship. And I had the pleasure of working with her during a series on mindfulness-based cancer recovery. And it was wonderful. And she is just a wonderful teacher, a wonderful instructor, and a wonderful doctor. And Dr. Wallace is known for taking a collaborative approach to care and working with each patient to develop individual treatment plans to address their needs and restore a quality of life. And that is so important, not just during any cancer recovery, but any recovery you're going through and just in your everyday life. Her clinical and research interests are centered in issues of cancer survivorship and treatment of caregivers. So thank you so much, Dr. Lyndsey Wallace, for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I love this topic. I've had different episodes on mindfulness and meditation, but this to me has become so much more important as needing to slow down in my life and acknowledging that my thoughts and my actions are all interconnected, especially going through my journey right now. So I want to kick things off with the basics, an introduction to mindfulness. So Dr. Wallace, what is mindfulness?
That's such a good question. And I think it's an important one because I think mindfulness is something, it's like a buzzword, right? We hear it all of the time. It's with everything. And so I always like to boil it down to 3 things. So it's really paying attention on purpose, moment by moment, without judgment. And usually when I pose that to people, a lot of times people are like, oh, that non-judgment piece is so difficult. And it is, right? I think so often we're kind of going through the motions and we're on autopilot and we're just kind of trying to get to the end of the day. But in doing so, we're not necessarily connecting to our thoughts and our emotions. And so mindfulness isn't necessarily a destination. It's a way of thinking about and living your life with intention and being deliberate. Rather than just going through the motions. So it's really about slowing down and recognizing or becoming aware of what our thoughts are doing and how they're influencing how we feel and what we do. It's simply put, slowing down and being in the here and now versus there and then.
Oh yeah. And I love that, the there and then part, right? Because we are always either looking back to see, oh, what could I have done better, or looking forward and not just being right here, right now. And I mean, I'm guilty of it. I'm still guilty of it in many times, but I know I'm personally getting better because it's important, right? It's, you want to be present. Sometimes we're either on our phone, too busy recording something, taking pictures, to actually just be. And that is so important. And I know there's a lot of myths about mindfulness. So what are some of the common myths about mindfulness?
I think one of the most common ones is that it's about like stopping your thoughts or turning your thoughts off. It's quite the opposite, actually. It's more about kind of tuning in or zoning into what your thoughts are doing and where they're taking you. So it's really quite active. I think it's one of those things where people think about mindfulness and they think about meditation, and it's something where you're just kind of sitting and you've got, a candle lit. When we talk about mindful meditation, it's really insight based, right? It's really trying to connect with what our thoughts are doing and how our body responds to that or reacts to that. So it's not just being lazy or taking time out. I think a lot of people struggle with making time to take care of themselves and actually check in with themselves. And so I always like to kind of dispute that a little bit and say that this is more about self-preservation than it is selfish. But I think in general, we struggle with this idea of, well, if we slow down, then it's going to take me longer to do something. But the research shows over and over, by slowing down and checking in with yourself, you're actually going to be more productive in the long run.
And I like that. It's not about stopping thoughts. I had somebody tell me once, think of it this way. If your thoughts have stopped, that means your brain has stopped. That means you're dead. That's not mindfulness. No. You don't want that. But it's hard. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but it's hard because sitting with your thoughts sometimes is uncomfortable. But it's something that you need to do, because you need to do that to build that awareness. And but it's scary. That's a scary place to be sometimes, especially if you have a lot going on.
Absolutely. And starting to learn that thoughts are just thoughts, right?
Yeah. Yes. So what are some other common myths?
I think some people think it's only for specific types of people, right? Like they think, oh, like you have to be really laid back or really into holistic health to be mindful. And quite frankly, we can all benefit from mindfulness. It's not just for a specific population or for going through a specific stressor. It's truly about kind of reconnecting us with our whys. Like, why are we doing what we're doing? And sometimes when we slow down, that helps reform that connection, and we just feel a little bit more in control of where we're going. And I think sometimes we can lose sight of that. So it really works on taking us off of that autopilot. So I don't care if you're dealing with a chronic illness or a job change, a relationship change. I think even if you're not going through a significant stressor, I think it's really helpful to tune into what our mind and our body is doing.
Oh, absolutely. Which kind of gets me to another question is, as you said, what type of person, but what type of attitude? What are some of the helpful attitudes for practicing mindfulness?
Yes, I'd say one of the most important attitudes is coming in with a beginner's mind, right? So I think we enter situations with assumptions and biases of what that's going to look like. And by doing so, we really limit our ability to experience it for what it is. So this idea can often be shown through just a simple activity that we do every single day, right? Like every day we're eating 3 meals a day and we're snacking, right? But so many of us are eating on the go, or we're doing something while also eating, and we're not necessarily paying attention to the food that we're putting into our body. So when I talk about this beginner's mind, even if you've done it hundreds of times, I want you to enter it as though this is the first time, just to see what's happening. It's almost like looking through a child's eyes, right? Like for most of their experiences, it's the first time. And it really allows you to be present when you approach things like that.
And I think that's important because you also learn new things, right? If you go in thinking you know it all, oh, I've done this before, I know it all, you miss things and you don't give yourself that growth opportunity and growth mindset to learn new things or learn new practices and techniques. or just be open to, oh, I didn't think of it that way, right? And again, it's about that growth.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it's the other thing that you said during the first part of the segment is the here and now versus the there and then. Can you do a little bit more explaining of that? Because I think sometimes people think, well, but I should look back and see where I can make improvements. And I should be looking forward and seeing, making plans for the future. So why is that bad? Why is the here and now better?
It's a great question. The here and now is really the only time that we have to actually implement change, right? So if we're rehearsing the future constantly, that's where that anxiety starts to stem from, because we're trying to plan for something that we don't know exactly how it's going to go. You can plan to your blue in the face, and it doesn't mean it's going to go that way, right? And when you're rehashing the past, that's where those symptoms of depression can come in. And so it's not that you can't ever go there, but if we're getting stuck there and it's preventing us from actually making decisions and choices in the present, then it becomes really problematic.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point to make, because it's like anything, even in your business world, you do want to debrief and say, okay, what can we do better for the future? But you can't be reliving all the problems and getting stuck there. It's the same thing in your personal life. You can't, or somebody who's made mistakes, because we're all human and we've all made mistakes. And if you just focus on somebody's mistakes and not seeing what they're doing in the future, I mean, it's the same thing there, right? Making sure that you've let go of that. What part of the tagline of the show, letting it go. We have to be able to just let it go and be in the moment.
Absolutely. And that's actually another helpful attitude with mindfulness. And I always like to phrase it as letting it be or setting it down, right? Because sometimes we just hold on to things, especially if it's something that we don't like. And when we hold on to that, it just creates a lot of tension. So a big part of mindfulness is being able to set some of these things down so that you can create space for other opportunities, right?
Yeah.
And so a good example of that is just with your breathing. For every in-breath you take, you have to let go of it to release that breath. And so it's just this idea of, even though we feel stuck and like things are just not moving, the reality is they're constantly changing. So it's remembering to be able to find a way to set that down.
Yeah. And that is perfect, because we all need to put that up on the bookshelf, put it in the parking lot, do something with it so that we can move forward. Well, let's take a quick break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about responding to stress. You are listening to Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills, living it up, loving it up, letting it go. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills, living it up, loving it up, letting it go. If you missed any portion of today's episode, you can catch it on getrootedradio.com. That's getrootedradio.com. Don't forget to subscribe online to receive the latest news, events, specials, and words of encouragement. Go to getrootedradio.com. Welcome back to my guest, Dr. Lyndsey Wallace. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
So happy to be here.
And during the last segment, we discussed and defined, for lack of better terms, what is mindfulness? And in this segment, we want to see how we respond to stress and how mindfulness can assist that. So just the basics here. Where does stress come from?
Such a good question. Stress gets such a bad rap, and not all stress is bad. So I always like to point that out. Stress comes from, inherently, it's meant to protect us, right? So long ago, when we had more kind of physical threats readily available, it helped protect us and know when we need to flee or fight a situation to protect ourselves. Now, over time, it doesn't even have to be a physical threat in front of us. Our thoughts can trigger that same response within our body. And what happens is that flight or fight response gets activated in our body. So that sympathetic nervous system. And what happens is we get that dump of adrenaline, and our blood is fleeing to our muscles and away from all of these other important organs in case we need to flee or fight. Another reaction in that moment can be to freeze. And sometimes we don't talk about that as much, but I think when we're feeling a severe threat to our well-being, it almost paralyzes us. And that's how we try to get through that acute issue. And then we start to, as we get space from it, we start to realize what just happened. But it can be a really quick automatic response.
Yeah. And I I fall into that freeze category a lot. And I sometimes classify that as, oh, it's my procrastination. It's not. It's the stress, and I, I know that I'm not running away. I know I'm not addressing it. I'm just there, and it's neat. It's good to hear that. That is it's an actual response in the body. So how do we overcome that, right? How do we use some of those abilities? Because like you said, stress isn't always bad. We need that. So we know, I feel those hairs on the back of my neck. I need to run. I need to, get out of that situation. And I've said this in other episodes, you need to listen to that internal GPS when those things happen. If you feel awkward about something, get the heck out of Dodge, right? Whatever situation it's in. But what do you mean, or what does it mean to respond to stress? How do we do that?
Great question. I think it's one of those things where I always like to differentiate responding from reacting. So I think in so many aspects of our life, we tend to react to things where it's at that knee jerk. It's just it's so quick, it's automatic. And it doesn't necessarily align with our values or what we're hoping the outcome of that situation is, but it just gets triggered so quickly. To cultivate more responding rather than reacting, it requires us to slow down a little bit in situations. So again, when that threat response, that flight or fight is activated initially, there's a whole physiological response that happens within our body that tells us, ooh, this is scary, this is threatening. And so by responding, it's noticing when you're starting to feel those stress responses, right? So for different people, it's different warning signs. Some people know they're starting to get stressed because they feel it in their shoulders or their neck. Some people notice it more emotionally. They're more irritable. Some people might find that they're engaging in behaviors that are not in their promotion of their health, right? And so it's recognizing what are some of those signs that maybe stress is starting to get up there for you so that you can start to recognize it a little bit easier. And when you recognize those signs, it allows you to slow down, take a breath, take account of what's the situation right now, what's going on. Does the situation warrant this kind of reaction, right? It allows you to slow down and be thoughtful and intentional with how you respond to that situation. It might be the exact same outcome, but you were in control versus whatever thoughts or emotions were triggered.
Yes. And I love that, because before I really got into mindfulness, and I've told this on some other episodes, and my son hates it every time I do it, but he was a biter when he was younger. And because he couldn't get his words out, he couldn't express himself. And so when he got upset, angry, frustrated, he would just bite another kid, whoever was right in front of him. Mm-hmm. And, to get through that, we talked about blow out the mad, take a minute and blow it out. And that gave him not the knee-jerk reaction, as you said, or in his case, biting. And it was before getting into mindfulness and all that, but it's that responding to stress. And I know I've been that way myself, where one of my siblings just there to help me, and I bit her head off, and I was like, where did that come from? And it was the reaction to stress, nothing to do with her, nothing what she said or did in that moment. It was everything else building up, and I didn't take the time to just relax and process what was all going on. And it's that we're listening to your body, because the signs were all there. Everything was there, but I was ignoring it. And that way you can do that, responding to the stress. Yes.
And knowing what those warning signs are, because otherwise we wait till things are really bad. And then it's really hard to manage that stress.
Yeah. And I think that leads me to, how do we become less reactive, right? How do we get rid of that itchy trigger finger, for lack of better terms? How do we get over that? Because sometimes it's so ingrained in us because we were never told to stop, or nobody ever addressed that, hey, settle down a little bit, or the famous word, never tell a woman to calm down, right? How do we though become less reactive?
Well, so this is important in that I think, again, trying to be more proactive rather than reactive. So again, I think we wait until things get really bad and then we try to de-escalate. My go-to for this is to be proactive throughout the day and do these mindful pauses or check-ins with yourself. And this doesn't have to take an inordinate amount of time, right? It can just be, after every time you finish a meal, sitting there for a second, breathing in for a couple of counts, breathing out for a couple of counts, and then moving on with your day. When you finish lunch, you do the same thing. So it's creating space to do these mindful pauses or check-ins. And when you're doing that breathing, it's connecting you with, where are my thoughts right now? How am I feeling? Am I feeling stress in my body or in my emotions? And you get a better gauge of where you're at, because if you catch that maybe something's off, it allows you to intervene.
Yeah. And I think that's important. It's what you said, is being proactive instead of reactive. It's just like exercising, right? We exercise because there's a lot of great benefits. We shouldn't exercise to try to fix our diet, right? Yep. Oh, I just ate 3 cheeseburgers at lunch, so I better go for a run tonight. That's being reactive, not proactive, because you're doing it for your health. Same thing with what you said. And I think you make a very good point. Sometimes people think mindfulness or meditation or the different practices that you do relating to mindfulness have to be this long, drawn out process. Like, I have to have at least 20 minutes. I have to have at least an hour. And as you said, it's not. It doesn't have to be for it to be effective. And if you are looking at it throughout the day.
I love distinguishing that too, because I think people think of just the formal piece, but there's a lot of informal things that we can do throughout the day to kind of slow down and check in with ourselves. And I talk about the breath a lot because it's the most accessible tool that we have. And it's so powerful in activating the opposite of that flight or fight, which is that rest and digest.
I like that, rest and digest, right? We do that, we don't eat and then go lay down right away.
Yep.
The same thing here. Can we take a moment to address what we're feeling so that we can have a better day going forward? So I love that. So we talked about, how do you become less how do we respond to stress? How do we become less reactive? How about how to cope with stress?
I always like to distinguish controllable events from uncontrollable events. So a lot of my work is in oncology. And so I'm faced with a lot of people that are in a situation that they had no control over. They can't do this thing and it'll make it better, right? And so I like to demonstrate. I think a lot of us feel more equipped to do kind of more problem-focused coping, right? Like, if I change this, then the outcome will be different, right? That feels really rewarding. But when it's a situation that you can't necessarily manipulate in any sort of way, it's distressing, right? It feels that there's that sense of hopelessness and helplessness and vulnerability that comes with it. And so that's when people start to get almost afraid of tapping into those emotions. I have lots of people say, oh my gosh, I'm afraid if I go there, I won't be able to turn it off. And so I like to talk about this idea of emotion-focused coping, which is just leaning in to whatever it is that you're feeling, just honoring what it is in that moment that comes up, naming it, experiencing it, and then being able to set it down and move on. Emotions are meant to come and go, and we don't get to pick and choose how we feel. It can't all be pleasant, right? Some of it has to be unpleasant. But it doesn't have to derail the rest of our day either. So really separating ourselves from that emotion can be helpful when it's a situation that we can't necessarily manipulate.
Yeah. And that's from a control freak here, right? And I think that's been my biggest problem, is the loss of control. And I've had people say, well, why are you still working and, working full time and trying to do all this stuff? I said, because I can control that. I have some sort of control, because the rest of my life right now, it's out of control, but nothing I can do about it, right? I can choose how I react to it and how I respond to it, but I can't make it go away. Nope. And it's those understanding the controllable versus uncontrollable events, and then accepting, right?
Yes.
Because you have to accept it. It's there. It's not going away.
It doesn't mean you like it. If you accept it, you don't have to like it, right? But if you resist things, then they persist, right?
Yes. And you don't want to unpack and stay there.
No.
Feel the feelings and let's move on. Let's get past it.
it takes the power away from them too. And I think sometimes just having the language to verbalize how we feel is something that can be really helpful. So if people are as familiar with emotion focused coping, I always start with an emotion wheel. Like, hey, let's start like naming different emotions so we can kind of tap into how we're feeling.
Yeah. And so we're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, one of my favorite weeks during the series that I attended with Dr. Wallace. It's going to talk about the stories we tell ourselves. So come back after this break and let's get into those stories we tell ourselves. I'm Erica Gifford Mills, and you are listening to Get Rooted Radio, living it up, loving it up, letting it go. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. We're back on Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills, living it up, loving it up, letting it go. Don't forget to visit getrootedradio.com to listen to a replay of this episode, sign up for helpful tips, and learn about upcoming events. That's getrootedradio.com. Welcome back to my guest, Dr. Lyndsey Wallace. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
So happy to be here.
So during the last two segments, we've discussed what is mindfulness and how to respond to stress. And then during this segment, we want to talk about the stories we tell ourselves. So we've talked about thoughts in mixed with the last couple segments, but how do thoughts influence how we feel and what we do?
So much. I think a lot of times I like to point out that sometimes it's not the events themselves that are distressing, but it's how we appraise that event, which is how we kind of create that narrative or that story around what's happening. And we have a personal narrative going all the time, whether it's about us or where we're going or the people we're seeing, right? And the pitfall of storytelling is that we might start to believe those stories to be completely true all of the time. And sometimes a thought is just a thought. So, and they're so automatic that if we believe every single thought that comes up, it's going to greatly impact how we feel and what we do. And that if we have a thought that says, like, for example, today, had I been like, oh, this makes me really anxious to do this podcast, I don't think I should do it, it makes me uncomfortable, so I didn't show up, like that thought directly impacted the outcome of a very significant event, right? And then I might be less likely to get in the future because I avoided it. So our thoughts can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah. And I like the analogy because I was having that same thing on my last episode. It's like, oh, it's been like 6 months and I'm really not feeling it, right? I'm not feeling getting back into this, and maybe I should postpone. And I'm like, nope, just do it. And even if it's not that good, guess what? It's done. It's over with. I got that feeling, that anxiety. Did I die? Nope. Guess what? I sure didn't. And I made my way through it. So it's the same sort of thing in everyday life. And I always like to think sometimes these thoughts that we have, thoughts become things. Mm-hmm. Negative thoughts and positive thoughts, right? Yep. And I also like to tell myself, I'm thinking this, I'm speaking to myself through my thoughts. Would I say that to a friend or a stranger? No, I would never have that thought to them. So why am I having it to myself? And because that influences how you feel every day. Absolutely. And sometimes we need reminders. I mean, I got a little Post-it note in my bathroom mirror to say, you are enough. Today's a good day for a good day, because those are reminders we need to tell ourselves.
Absolutely. And again, I think learning how to look at thoughts rather than from them can be really helpful in differentiating that, right? Because I think sometimes we embody our thoughts and we think like, that's what's really happening. So you might have had a really rough start to your day, but it doesn't mean the rest of your day is going to be horrible.
Yeah. And I like that because it is Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And I know I've had, as many people have as they're going through their journey. I will have had my double mastectomy and I will be having reconstruction. And my thought is, I'm going to be damaged, right? That initial thought of I'm damaged goods. Now I'm not going to be, not that I was by any means perfect, but wow, I'm going to be imperfect, right? And how is anybody going to want to be with me, physically, emotionally? And those thoughts, of course, have entered because it's the unknown. And so your brain is hardwired to go to what's the negative thought, as opposed to just living with, you don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
And if I let those thoughts continue to take over, I would never get anywhere. And so it's natural to have those thoughts and to think about it, but it's quickly get those nasty things out of your mind.
Right.
And move forward.
Right.
Yeah. So with that, you talked about those thoughts kind of get in your head, well, literally get in your head. But what is that relationship between the thoughts and then the body's stress response?
So if we think about, if you're having a thought that feels really threatening, right? Like, for example, if you're going into surgery thinking, oh my gosh, I'm going to be damaged goods. What is this going to mean for me? You're right. We do have that tendency to jump to kind of that worst case scenario, or we catastrophize. And when that happens, our body doesn't distinguish between, oh, she's just thinking this, versus it reacts as though it's actually happening in this moment. So you get that same dump of adrenaline, your blood's flowing to the muscles, away from the organs. And so you have that physiological response as though perhaps a lion was standing right in front of you. So you can imagine, if you're having threatening thoughts over and over and over again, how draining that is mentally and physically.
Yeah. And because it is, thoughts become things. I mean, you can get yourself all worked up. It's like somebody who's having anxiety attack, right? And then the more you think, then the more you start breathing, and then, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? And I don't know what to do. And it's that wrapped up. And you said catastrophizing. No, I can't even say that word. But that's a pitfall of thinking. What are some other common pitfalls?
So another common one is jumping to conclusions. So if we go into a situation, this is kind of where that beginner's mind comes in. If we go in kind of assuming that it's going to go like this, or if something wasn't exactly how you expected it to be, then you assume it's going to be something else. And that can greatly influence your experience around things. Another common one is all or none, or some people call it black or white thinking, where we get so rigid that it has to be absolute one way or the other. And that's just not reality, right? We live very much in the gray, but for some reason we like to package things on the end of a spectrum, right? Or polarize things. And that can create a lot of anxiety and stress, because if it's not this specific way or this thing, then it feels like it's wrong, or you failed, or it's bad.
Yes. And I laughing, trying not to laugh because it's not funny, but I'm like, oh, yep, I've been there. Oh yeah, I do that. And I've also had told people, sometimes people set the bar so high. And I'm not saying not to have certain expectations or to know you deserve certain things. But sometimes when we set the bar so high, your thinking can never get there, right? And that is a pitfall, is that you can say, this is how I hope it's going to be, and this is how, the positive thinking. But if it doesn't go that way, how do you roll with it, right? And so how do we roll with those thoughts? How do we observe those thoughts so that we can, I don't want to say take control, but so that we can.
That's a good way to say it, though. I think it's taking back the power, right? Because it should be you deciding versus your thoughts. And it starts really basic. I think everything with mindfulness is becoming aware and noticing what's happening. And so a really great exercise for us to kind of connect us to some of these automatic thoughts is just to notice when you have a shift in your emotion, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, but usually if there's a shift in how we're feeling, that means some sort of situation just triggered a specific thought in our mind. So let's say I was walking down the hallway and I saw a colleague that I know quite well, but they didn't happen to look at me or say anything to me. If my automatic thought took over, I would have been like, oh my God, I did something wrong. What did I do? They must be so mad at me, right? And if that's my thought process, I'm going to be so anxious throughout the whole day and distracted. And so what I would have done is, I'm feeling really anxious right now. What just happened? Oh, hey, this person walked by and didn't say hi to me. I'm assuming it's about me, but gosh, it could be a number of things, right? Like maybe she's really busy. She had to rush to get somewhere. She just got bad news. Like kind of reframing or coming up with other alternatives for why that situation might have happened versus kind of globbing onto that initial automatic thought.
Yes, absolutely. And so what are some questions that you can ask yourself to be able to observe the thoughts, to not, again, have that knee-jerk reaction and assuming, right? Because we all know what assuming does. And, you know, what are some questions that you might ask?
One of the biggest one is like, how is this serving me right now? Is this helping me be productive in any sort of way? You know, what evidence do I have to support this thought, right? Sometimes even playing detective of like, all right, this is where my head went, but like, what is there to support this? You know, asking yourself, is there a different way to look at this? Is the most helpful way to interpret the situation that I'm in right now? And then often also saying like, if that's the case, if maybe she's mad at me, like, what is the worst outcome with that? Like, is the outcome necessarily that catastrophic? Because a lot of times we will take it to just the worst case. And oftentimes, like, it's never as bad as we make it up into our mind, right? We can create these really scary stories, but it's generally never as bad as we think it's going to be.
Yes. And I think that it's I like to call it the thought onion, right? You have this initial thought, right? You know, the superficial thought or the assumption, right? And then how do we peel those layers back to really get at the root of what is it? And if we don't have those conversations or really ask those questions, we're going to always assume the worst case scenario.
Right. And then if you've taken those narratives and you've run with them, then you're just more activated in every situation. It takes less and less to get you anxious over time.
Yes. Well, we're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, let's talk about putting mindfulness into practice. This is Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills. Living it up, loving it up, letting it go. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills. Living it up, loving it up, letting it go. If you missed any of the information during the last segments, go to getrootedradio.com. That's getrootedradio.com to listen to the replay. Don't forget to subscribe, sign up for tips and special events and pricing for upcoming coaching sessions at getrootedradio.com. Welcome back to my guest, Dr. Lyndsey Wallace. Thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I personally appreciate your time, as mindfulness has been a wonderful tool in my toolbox during this journey that I'm going through, but it is so important and something everyone can utilize in their daily lives.
Yep.
And so I know we've been talking during our last segments about, you know, what is it? How do we respond to it? But let's talk about putting it all together and putting it into practice. So what's a great starting point for someone interested in mindfulness?
So I think the breath is always a really great place to start because it can serve as a very reliable anchor regardless of what we're going through. And it's so accessible, right? We have to have our breath throughout the day. So regardless of where you're at, it's there. And I think we often take it for granted and we only notice it if we're short of breath or our endurance has changed, right? And our breath is the one kind of reliable way to activate that rest and digest. It's the one way we can manipulate our body to calm down and relax. So there's so many different breathing exercises out there, which I know can feel overwhelming. And I think a big part of mindfulness is not overthinking what you're doing. Because some people will be like, am I breathing deep enough? Am I breathing long enough? It's listening, trusting to your body as well throughout the process. But a really great starting point is just a balanced breathing exercise where you're breathing in through the nose for 4 counts. So in and out through the mouth for 4 counts. You go in and out, and it's almost like waves kind of rolling in and out. And that balance just helps kind of balance your mind out and your body out as well.
Yeah. And I like that. It's nothing that you have to go buy. It's no special tool that you need. You already have it. You're using it every day. And it's something that you can control, right? You can take that moment and you don't need to leave the room to go change your clothes and do anything. It's your breath. And
Yep.
You just take the time and play around, because I think that's the biggest thing. One breathing exercise that might work for one person may not be somebody else's favorite. So
Yep.
as you said, there's a lot out there which can seem overwhelming, but now you have options. So if this first one doesn't work for you, try a different one. Doesn't mean that one won't work.
Right. And, different circumstances call for different things too, right? And so some people really like square breathing, where it's breathing in for 4, holding that breath for 4, breathing out for 4, and breathing and holding that out breath for 4. So I always encourage people to try things a couple of times before you decide if it's for you or not.
Yes. 100% agree. I mean, it's, and I relate things back to exercise because most people have done it, right?
Yep.
Just because this one type of exercise didn't work doesn't mean all exercise isn't going to work. Same thing with breathing. Just because this one might not have been effective for you, give it a chance. You always have to give it a couple times, and then, okay, try something else, because there is a plethora of breathing techniques out there.
So many. And I think some people get intimidated. I think some of the myths around mindfulness too, again, are this idea that it has to take a long time, or you just have to sit in silence. There's so many different activities that you can do that feel a little bit more flexible, rather than just focusing on one thing.
So what is another technique or another example?
So one that I love, because it kind of pulls in the sensory experience, it's called Leaves on a Stream. And it's this idea, it's meant to kind of work on separating you from your thoughts, right? Again, this idea of looking at the thoughts rather than from the thoughts. And it's this idea of envision yourself kind of sitting on the bank of a river or a stream. So we can go through it.
Yes. I'm like, yes, let's go do it. I like this one.
One thing that I encourage people to do is when you are doing more of a formal meditation, it's really important to feel like physically grounded. So putting your feet, both feet on the ground and feeling it. And then I'll just have you guys sit and close your eyes or either lower your gaze, just focusing on your breath. Just noticing the in and the out. Not needing to change anything about your breath, just noticing it. And then I want you to visualize yourself sitting beside a gently flowing stream with leaves floating along the surface of the water. For the next minute, take each thought that enters your mind and place it on a leaf. And let it float by. Do this with each thought, whether it's pleasurable, painful, or neutral. Even if you have joyous or enthusiastic thoughts, placing them on that leaf and letting them float by. And if your thoughts momentarily stop, continuing to watch that stream, sooner or later your thoughts will start up again. I want you to allow that stream to flow at its own pace. Don't try to speed it up and rush your thoughts along. You're not trying to rush the leaves along or get rid of your thoughts. You're allowing them to come and go at their own pace. If your mind says, this is dumb, I'm bored, I'm not doing this right, place those thoughts on leaves too and let them pass. If a leaf gets stuck, allow it to hang around until it's ready to float by. And if the thought comes up again, watch it float by another time. If a difficult or painful feeling arises, simply acknowledge it. Say to yourself, I notice myself having a feeling of boredom, impatience, frustration. And place those thoughts on leaves and allow them to float along. From time to time, your thoughts may hook you and distract you from being fully present. That's very normal. As soon as you realize that you've been sidetracked, you just gently bring your attention right back to that stream, the sound of the stream running by, the colors of the leaves that are coming through the water. And just be willing to place that thought on a leaf and let it go. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes.
That's one of my favorite ones. One, because, trees and leaves, I love them, but also the sound, right? The thought of the water moving reminds me of the sound of water, which always relaxes me. Yeah. And I think it's so many, if you can get in a lot of those visualizations and really get into that, you find your thoughts are more easily floating down the stream, right?
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I do love that one. Thank you.
Of course.
So I know we're running short of time, but before we go, what are some last minute tips for setting aside time for formal meditation?
I think the way that you talk about it, so don't say I'm going to fit this in, because then you won't get it in. I think actually carving out time in your day, it can only, if it needs to be 5 minutes or 10 minutes, setting aside time where you can go somewhere, nobody's going to need you, nobody's going to interrupt you. If you are someone that wants to do more formal meditation, like having a space in your house where you can go and not be interrupted, it's comfortable. The more you return to that place, the easier it is for your body to know what's going to happen, and it gets deeper with that meditation. For those of you that sometimes like more guidance on meditations, Insight Timers are a really great app that I have a lot of my patients use. It's free, which is lovely, but it allows you to play around with different meditations. And I think that's really important to figure out what you need and when you need it. So it's a good starting point.
Wonderful. And I do love Insight Timer. I've been using it ever since you suggested it. I've been using it every day. So I quite enjoy it. So good. Thank you so much, Dr. Lyndsey Wallace from Medical College of Wisconsin. Thank you so much for joining us. And I appreciate all your time and all your work that you do with your patients. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks so much.
And I want to thank you all for tuning in to Get Rooted Radio. If you missed any part of today's episode or you want to listen again, go to getrootedradio.com for the podcast. And don't forget to tune in the first and third Monday of each month at 5 p.m. Eastern, 4 p.m. Central, and 2 p.m. Pacific, right here on Transformation Talk Radio. Thank you for tuning in. Have an amazing day. And I'm looking forward to the next time on Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills. Living it up, loving it up, letting it go. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Get Rooted Radio with Erica Gifford Mills, living it up, loving it up, and letting it go. Visit getrootedradio.com if you've missed any part of this hit show, and tune in on transformationtalkradio.com to live fearlessly in your more and powerfully rooted in your unlimited yes. For more information and to work with Erica directly, visit getrootedradio.com. That's getrootedradio.com, and get ready to live it up, love it up, and let it go.